On October 27, 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in recorded history. Not because of a missile launch, not because of a public declaration of war, but because of a single decision made in isolation deep beneath the ocean's surface. For several hours that day, the fate of civilization rested on one man's refusal to follow orders, and no one outside that submarine knew it was happening. By late October 1962, the Cold War had reached a breaking point. The United States and the Soviet Union had spent years preparing for a war they both believed would eventually come. Nuclear weapons had transformed global politics into a permanent state of fear. Then American reconnaissance flights discovered something unthinkable. Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed in Cuba, less than 90 miles from the coast of Florida. If activated, these missiles could reach Washington, D.C. in minutes. President John F. Kennedy convened his advisors in secret. The public was told almost nothing. Behind closed doors, military leaders urged immediate action. The United States Navy was ordered to surround Cuba. Officially, it was called a quarantine. In reality, it was a naval blockade, an act of war. What made the situation especially dangerous was how many weapons were already in motion. American bombers carrying nuclear payloads were placed on high alert. Missile crews prepared for launch. Civil defense drills were quietly activated in major cities. On the Soviet side, commanders were given expanded authority. Communication delays meant that decisions might need to be made without confirmation from Moscow. Both sides believed the other might strike first, and both sides were preparing to respond instantly. The margin for error had vanished. Unknown to the United States, the Soviet Navy had deployed 4 diesel-powered submarines toward Cuba. Each submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. These weapons were smaller than intercontinental missiles, but their explosive power rivaled the bombs dropped on Hiroshima. American naval forces did not know the submarines were nuclear-armed. Even worse, they did not know how close they already were. On October 27th, U.S. Navy destroyers detected a Soviet submarine later identified as B-59. Following standing orders, American ships began dropping practice depth charges. These were not meant to destroy the submarine. They were signal explosives, warnings intended to force it to surface. But inside the submarine, the situation looked very different. The crew had been submerged for days. Temperatures inside exceeded 100 degrees. Oxygen levels were dropping. Batteries were nearly depleted. Most critically, communication with Moscow had been lost. The officers aboard B-59 had no way of knowing whether war had already begun. Every explosion sounded like an attack. The crew believed they were under assault. Soviet naval doctrine at the time allowed submarine commanders to launch nuclear torpedoes under certain conditions, especially if they believed a war had started. The weapon was prepared. The launch procedure required the agreement of 3 officers. 2 of them believed the Americans had begun the war. The 3rd officer was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov was not the submarine's captain. He was a flotilla commander, a senior officer aboard B-59 due to his rank and experience. He disagreed with the others. Arkhipov argued that the explosions were warning signals, not an attack. He insisted that launching a nuclear torpedo would guarantee full-scale war. Inside the submarine, arguments erupted. Voices were raised. The heat was unbearable. Air was scarce. The crew stood by the nuclear weapon, waiting for authorization. For hours, the decision hung unresolved. If the torpedo had been launched, it would have detonated near the American fleet. The United States would have interpreted the explosion as a nuclear strike. Standard response protocols would have followed. Retaliation would have been immediate. Within hours, nuclear weapons would have been exchanged between the United States and the Soviet Union. There would have been no chance to stop it. Eventually, Arkhipov convinced the others to surface the submarine instead of launching the weapon. B-59 emerged from the water, surrounded by American warships. No one fired. The submarine was allowed to leave the area. And just like that, the most dangerous moment of the Cold War passed, unnoticed by the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis officially ended days later through secret negotiations between Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. The missiles were removed from Cuba. Publicly, it appeared that diplomacy had prevailed. What the public did not know was how close everything had come to ending. The existence of the nuclear torpedo aboard B-59 remained classified for decades. Arkhipov's role was not acknowledged. There were no medals, no public recognition, no record of the decision that may have saved millions of lives. During the Cold War, admitting how close the world came to nuclear war was considered dangerous. Governments feared panic. They feared loss of public trust, and they feared revealing how fragile their command systems truly were. So the story remained buried in archives. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides made limited improvements. Communication lines were improved, some protocols were clarified, but the fundamental problem remained. Weapons capable of ending civilization were still placed in situations where human judgment mattered most. And failed communication was always possible. What makes this story disturbing is not that nuclear war was narrowly avoided. It's that it was avoided accidentally, not by a system, not by safeguards, but by one individual choosing restraint in a moment designed to eliminate hesitation. The systems that nearly failed in 1962 still exist today. And the next decision may not belong to someone willing to say no.